Good morning. Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to reach out and get in touch with us, then feel free to give us a call or send a text to 812-550-6234, or you could send email to info@riverridgechurch.org. Those are great ways to get us your questions or your comments or a request for a future topic of study on this program. We also have a radio show that airs every Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m. on 98.5 here in Evansville, and you can get it on 1400 AM if you're a little farther out. I would also encourage you to check out our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ, especially in light of today's topic, because there is a rather long and ever-growing series on our YouTube channel that's just called The Whole Bible. We have been going through and looking at the Bible in each of its sections and books. We've had many installments in this series, and you can find all of the previous episodes on that YouTube channel, and that would be a great way for you to catch up. We started by just doing overviews, an overview of the whole thing, then an overview of the Old Testament, an overview of the New Testament. We even did a week looking at the Apocrypha, which doesn't really belong in the Bible, but nevertheless we took a look at it. And then we broke it down into the Torah and the Gospels and the Old Testament history and the letters of Paul and so on and so forth. More recently, we have been looking at one book at a time, and sometimes we'll compile together two or three that are connected. So, for example, we looked at Paul's prison epistles, and then we looked very recently at Paul's post-prison epistles, which are sometimes called the pastorals. But in the Old Testament, we've been looking at, single books like Lamentations, and most recently, I believe, we looked at Ruth. There's lots more to come in this series, and each installment is geared toward an introduction to the book in question, based on the book itself, not a bunch of opinions about the book, but making use of the sort of insights that can take several read-throughs to put together. Today, we're looking at another of these Old Testament books, Proverbs. This one is harder to approach than most of the others. Let me give you an illustration of why. In Proverbs chapter 14, let's read verses 13 through 15. Even in laughter the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. The backslider in heart will be filled with the fruit of his ways, and a good man will be filled with the fruit of his ways. The simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. Well, these are all wise sayings. They're also completely unrelated to one another. Now, that's not always the case. For example, in the same chapter, verse 16, one who is wise is cautious and turns away from evil, but a fool is reckless and careless. A man of quick temper acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated. Well, we do see now, too, on a similar topic. And then it's back to, verse 18, the simple inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge. The evil bow down before the good, the wicked at the gates of the righteous. Much of the book is like this. It's disconnected. They are proverbs, which is to say, short, practical truisms that have been compiled for our benefit, generally upholding God's basic expectations of us. This is not the gospel. Now, it's in the Old Testament, of course, so you wouldn't expect it to be the gospel of Jesus Christ, but really you can see the gospel in Genesis and in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. We could keep going like this for a while. In Proverbs, the gospel is significantly less apparent. There are even disagreements within the book. Sort of. Chapter 26, verse 4. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Okay, that sounds sensible. The idea here is if you argue with a fool, then you're probably going to end up making a fool of yourself, at least in the eyes of someone else, if not in reality. Now let's read the very next verse. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. That also sounds sensible, but we just read verse 4, which said the opposite. So which one of these are we supposed to follow? Now, the greater point is that, especially where a fool is involved, sometimes you have to pick your poison. The world is a confusing and contradictory place, and there is seldom a perfect answer to any quandary. You won't get everything you want, even if you want good things. So, learn to give some things up and make compromises where necessary. That doesn't mean that good should compromise with evil, because then the result is just evil. But the desire to avoid even appearing, let alone being, foolish, is a good thing, and a desire to correct a fool and show him the right path is also a good thing. Pick one. This is the kind of earthly, basic, simple, practical wisdom and advice you can expect throughout most of Proverbs. Let's go back to the beginning of the book. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So first of all, we've got the author of this book, which is really more of a compiler. It's not as if Solomon thought up all of these sayings, but they are sayings passed down, and he is collecting them and putting them all together. And this portion also tells us the purpose of the book, which was to extend knowledge and wisdom and to give instruction, all those sorts of things. Verse 7 serves as the main theme of the book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, within that, we mostly get a lot of disconnected one-offs, some of which are repeated, even nearly verbatim. There is an old and superstitious and ridiculous method of divination that involves posing a question to God and then opening the Bible to a random passage and reading whatever you happen to read first as God's tailor-made response to your inquiry. I hope I don't have to tell you that this is, well, dumb. But if you happen to end up in Proverbs, at least the lack of context most likely won't be a major hindrance to you, because this book is really meant to be read piecemeal. In fact, I send out a sort of weekly newsletter to the members here at River Ridge, and at the beginning of each one I include a verse or two that can stand alone nicely, easily be remembered, and can go with everyone through the week and help them focus on spiritual things and behaving as God intends. More than half of these are from Proverbs. Now that doesn't mean that there are no broader themes. Chapter 1, verse 8, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching." Now that stands alone just fine, but this verse actually ended with a comma, not a period. Verse 9, "For they are a graceful garland for your head, and pendants for your neck." Sometimes, as in examples that we've already examined, it's more than just the what, it's also about the why, and this is the case here. But he's not done there. Verse 10, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, 'Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all precious goods, we shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us, we will all have one purse.' My son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths. For their feet run to do evil, and they make haste to shed blood. For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. But these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors." So what was I saying earlier about a bunch of disjointed one-offs? This seems like a totally coherent paragraph, one thought leading directly to the next. And it is. The theme here is pretty obvious. Don't give in to peer pressure tempting you to sin. And there's more of this to follow immediately afterward. Verse 20, "Wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the market she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy streets she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you." Here we see wisdom personified as a woman who is competing to sell her product in the marketplace while others are selling scams and as seen on TV products to foolish and unsuspecting customers. This personification of wisdom is a common poetic device, and it provides a segue. This whole book is poetry. Nearly every verse is a couplet, which is to say 2 lines of verse. Now that means that it's going to be slightly harder to understand, and also noticeably easier to remember. And it affords the opportunity for various other techniques, including parallelism, chiasmus, metonymy, and many others that you probably don't care about. So let's recap what we've got so far. A poetic book of pithy truisms, a general exhortation to seek wisdom and know God, prepared by a father for his son. That's the essence of Proverbs. We don't know whether Solomon intended it for one son in particular. He had quite a few, although I think it's safe to say that if he made it for Rehoboam, it was a colossal failure. It's perhaps more likely that the address to my son is itself a poetic device, and not too different from the Apostle John addressing his letters in the New Testament to my little children, not meaning his physical offspring. But that's the idea. It has a distinctly and deliberately male perspective, not out of some chauvinism, but for the same reason you can find self-help books and Bible study manuals and devotionals targeted specifically at men or at women. So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, and her paths to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. This is another common theme in the book of Proverbs. The paternal wisdom section continues through the end of chapter 9 with several subsections. We've already seen the general appeal to wisdom and the warning against sexual immorality. It's not just about keeping clean for the sake of having a decent life, though. That's the way that it generally turns out. But this father figure has a more lofty goal in mind, and we can see this in chapter 3. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. This is about the relationship with God, which in turn will affect your material circumstances here on earth. Hold up. Wait a second. I distinctly remember going through the book of Job on this program a while back, and one of the conclusions we drew from that book was that your material circumstances don't necessarily line up with the relative strength of your relationship with God. In fact, much of Job's argument hinged on the fact that the wicked often prosper and the innocent often suffer. Have you looked around the world lately? Wicked men prosper by sinning against the weak all the time. It's often the fastest path to material wealth, in fact. Is Solomon just another one of those robber baron types who doesn't care about the little people he has to step on in order to get ahead and justifies his bad behavior on the grounds that, well, God must love me, just look how much he's blessed me? No. But that brings up one of the reasons I've said this is a book of pithy truisms, not hard and fast eternal truths. The pithy truisms point toward the eternal truths. But you can probably cite some examples where people behaved righteously with their money and yet did not end up with great abundance of wealth. I'm sure you can think of examples who stole or cheated their way into great wealth, too. But the eternal truth isn't disproven by the temporary hiccup in the system. Those who use evil means to amass power and wealth can lose it all in a moment, regardless of how much faith they put in their riches. Those who put no faith in their riches will, first of all, generally find that they have enough, and secondly, they will amass unimaginable treasure in the unreachable security of heaven. That second part isn't exactly what Solomon has in mind as he shares his earthly wisdom with us in Proverbs, but it's definitely on the Holy Spirit's mind. Okay, this section cycles through several themes between the same themes of sexual integrity and financial integrity and respect for God that we've already seen, an extension of which is respect for parents and tradition, and it's all wrapped up in the language of seeking wisdom. In chapter 5, we get some details on the sexual integrity that the father is trying to instill in his son, both the prohibitions and the instructions this time. My son, be attentive to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion, and your lips may guard knowledge. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life, her ways wander, and she does not know it. He's not talking about eternal consequences, just how it's going to turn out badly for you in this life. And that's bad enough, and it's borne out by... well, just look around. In contrast to this, verses 15 through 19, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. There are some interesting metaphors in there that we probably wouldn't use today, but I think the point is pretty clear. Show me an old couple, each one on their first and only marriage, who've been together for several decades, and at least 9 times out of 10, I'll show you a couple that's far happier than their peers who've been around the block a few times and put a lot of notches on that bedpost. That old couple is going to be just as much in love as they were when they first got married, if not more so. Verse 20 is particularly meaningful. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman, and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? His point is that you've got a perfectly good source for this kind of intoxication if you'll nurture that relationship with your own wife, and it's much safer to be infatuated by someone to whom you are already bound than to get entangled with some pretty chickie who, if she's willing to sleep with a married man like you, is by definition not concerned with the integrity of anyone's marriage. How many times have you seen a friend or a coworker have an affair, get a divorce, then marry the person they were cheating with, only for that blossoming new marriage to implode upon itself in short order? It doesn't happen every time, but it is hilariously common. Sexual passion is quite a drug, and giving into it without guardrails leads us to do some really, really foolish things that displease God, harm the people around us, and even harm ourselves. The meth addict enjoys doing meth and deliberately chooses to give in to that desire, but it's obvious for an outside observer to see that before long he is totally enslaved to it, to his own harm. It's less obvious to other meth addicts who are enslaved in the same way, though. The same is true of those who are slaves to their sexual passions. It leads nowhere good. And those who don't share the addiction, or those recovering from the addiction, can almost see the soul-sucking demon with his teeth buried in your neck if you're still enslaved in this way. Don't do it. The cycle continues. Let's take a gander at one of the sections focused on pleasing God. Chapter 6, verse 16. There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. It's easy to say that you're a good person because you've never killed anyone or overtly planned evil, but have you ever had haughty eyes? Have you ever lied with your tongue? Have you ever gotten between brothers to divide them? Those are on the same list for a reason. There's more about adultery in the latter part of chapter 6 and chapter 7. 7 is interesting. It's a narrative of observing some poor sap being taken in by a seductress. Chapter 9 ends this section, and it personifies wisdom and folly, presenting wisdom as a kind-hearted and hard-working woman, the kind that you want to spend your life with. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars, she has slaughtered her beasts, she has mixed her wine, she has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town, "Whoever is simple, let him turn in here." To him who lacks sense, she says, "Come, eat of my bread, and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live, and walk in the ways of insight." Folly is a ditz who only cares about physical pleasure for the next 5 minutes, and the future with her is not pretty. The woman Folly is loud. She is seductive and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house. She takes a seat on the highest places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their way. "Whoever is simple, let him turn in here." And to him who lacks sense, she says, "Stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant." But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. That ends the first and most cohesive portion of the book. Chapters 10 through 22 are... Well, let's just start with verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. Treasures gained by wickedness do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who brings shame. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. So there's obviously a lot of valuable stuff there, but it's haphazard and disjointed, just a rapid-fire pearls of wisdom. It's a list of proverbs compiled by Solomon. Unlike the first 9 chapters, which were organized broadly around the theme of a father sharing some directed advice with his son, this is just a list of old sayings that ring true and are worth remembering and implementing in our lives. Granted, a lot of the same things will pop up. wisdom and folly, hard work and money management, God's eye on the righteous, those sorts of things. But this is the portion of the book running from chapter 10 all the way to chapter 22, where you could open to a random spot, read one verse, and generally come away with something worthwhile and instructive. When it goes well with the righteous, the city rejoices, and when the wicked perish, there are shouts of gladness. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. It is better to be of a lowly spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. This conglomeration of useful tidbits ends at chapter 22, verse 17, where begins a new section. Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge. For it will be pleasant if you keep them within you, if all of them are ready on your lips. That your trust may be in the Lord, I have made them known to you today, even to you. Have I not written for you 30 sayings of counsel and knowledge, to make you know what is right and true, that you may give a true answer to those who sent you? What follows here are the 30 sayings of the wise, from chapter 22, verse 22 through chapter 24, verse 22, comprising 65 verses. It's not completely clear where saying of the wise number 1 ends and saying of the wise number 2 begins, and on down the line. That brings us to the next section, which begins with chapter 25, verse 1. These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah king of Judah copied. It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search things out. As the heavens for height, and the earth for depth, so the heart of kings is unsearchable. Take away the dross from the silver, and the smith has material for a vessel. Take away the wicked from the presence of the king, and his throne will be established in righteousness. So, we've got themes again. This group of Proverbs is about kings. There are more of these loose collections, but for the most part, this section is the same sort of grab bag that we saw in chapters 10 through the first part of chapter 22. A couple of my favorites are in here, though. We already looked at 26 verses 4 and 5 about fools, but I'd also like to take a look at 27 verse 17. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. We're getting down toward the end of the book. Chapter 30 verse 1. The words of Agur, son of Jakeh, the oracle. The man declares, I am weary, O God, I am weary, O God, and worn out. Who's Agur? I don't know. No one does. But Solomon seems to, and he seems to have wanted his words compiled with his Proverbs. There's not a ton that's new here in chapter 30, but it has its own distinctive flavor with a slightly more artful tone than much of the book. There are 2 more sections before we wrap up. Chapter 31, beginning in verse 1. The words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? Who's King Lemuel? I don't know. No one does. Although there are some halfway decent theories about this one. Verses 2 through 9 are a mother's advice to her son, the king. And then verse 10 begins an acrostic poem. Let's read the first portion of it. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. This goes all the way down to the end of the Hebrew alphabet, extolling the amazing work and worth of a good woman. There's a bizarre idea circulated by the more cultural revolutionary types that says in the dark patriarchal days of the past, women were expected to stay at home, look pretty, make babies, and keep quiet, and that the awful chauvinistic men who somehow came to be in charge of hiring workers refused to hire women due to feeling threatened by them. In actuality, in the dark patriarchal days of the past, everyone had to work, and the work was always hard, and the men and women simply sorted themselves into doing the work they were best suited to do. Those jobs that required lots of physical strength, like moving around very heavy things and fighting off the strongest people that the neighboring town's raiders have to offer, were going to be done by men. Those that required caring for and nurturing other human beings were going to be done by women. Men don't have the equipment physically, and usually don't have it mentally or emotionally either, to do those jobs. This goes back to something we talked about earlier. Men and women are different. Since we rely on machines and computers to do so many things for our society today, some of the distinctions are less obvious to us, and there's pent-up resentment about dumb things among both sexes. Go to the most primitive backwater village in Mozambique or Guatemala or Mongolia, and you know what you won't find? Argument from men or women against the picture that Proverbs 31 paints of a strong, hard-working, priceless woman. A lot of our conflicts are only possible because we've made such incredible technological advancements. Now, the burn-it-all-down types would generally argue that In view of the technology, we should no longer subject ourselves to the sort of restrictions that God built in for us, that bigot. But it just doesn't work that way. It doesn't make anyone happier or more content when we ignore the roles that God designed for us. Women have been continuously surveyed in large numbers. In the U.S., they are less happy today on average than they were when the marriage rate was higher, when the fertility rate was higher, when women typically weren't gainfully employed. Sure, some are happier with the way that things are now, but far more feel torn between the desire to bear and nurture kids and the desire to make money and feel like they're independent of men. Frankly, they've been sold a bill of goods by the feminist movement, which has never really delivered on its promises. Women are less happy, less satisfied with life, less fulfilled today. Now, feeling happy and satisfied and fulfilled isn't all that it's cracked up to be. You can feel those things when you really shouldn't. But in those cases, it generally won't last. It's just waiting for the fall. But if we will consult the manufacturer's instructions for how to use the bodies he's given us for a lifetime, we'll find it makes a lot more sense than the ravings of a disgruntled customer. Ultimately, that's where Proverbs ends, on the role of a good woman, and it's basically where we're going to wrap up too. God knows best, regardless of what we think. So much of our time is spent on nonsense that won't stand the test of time. Let's read 2 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 11. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn? But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. This is the general focus each of us should keep: eyes on Christ. A lot of the particulars of daily life are less obvious, and Proverbs is incredibly practical. Read it, learn it, and apply its wisdom to your life day in and day out, and you'll be in much better shape than if you spent that same time participating in arguments online or watching the latest TV show that's just a semi-pornographic reboot of a rehash of an adaptation of what was once an interesting idea, or spending money that you don't have on clothes and liquor that you think will make you happy and finally fill that hole in your heart. Proverbs is about the metaphorical incarnation of wisdom, as we read a few times. Wisdom is presented as an attribute inseparable from God himself. And here in this book, he has deposited a vast trove of that wisdom for us to learn and imitate. Ultimately, this is imitating God and behaving as his son Jesus behaved in this world. Solomon didn't write Proverbs to point us to heaven. Solomon didn't even know whether death was the end for a human being. But in light of what we know from the New Testament, this is one of the most helpful books for us to study and implement as we struggle through life trying to please him. That's what we're all trying to do at River Ridge. If you'd like to join us and help us build a community of wise, just, honest, reverent, and loving followers of Christ, then please get in touch with us. You can call or text us at 812-550-6234 or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. on Sundays for Bible study, 10 a.m. for worship, 4 p.m. for afternoon worship, and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.